In my opinion, Apple has introduced a groundbreaking, absolutely revolutionary new product, and the reactions were interesting. Questions were asked like, who needs something like this anyway? What kind of poor battery life is this? Are we all supposed to walk around with such a thing in the future? And one criticism particularly stuck with me, coming from a well-known CEO, or rather a well-known former CEO, who slightly adapted expressed himself as follows: $500 for a phone? That is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine. Those were the words of Steve Ballmer, the former CEO of Microsoft, in 2007 when he was asked in an interview about his first impression of the newly introduced iPhone. And what this historic misjudgment has to do with the general reaction to the introduction of the Apple Vision Pro last week, that's what today's video is all about. In this spirit, hello and welcome to our weekly. However, let's stick with the iPhone for a moment. When Apple introduced the iPhone on January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs initiated it with the words, "Every once in a while a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything." But the reactions back at the time were quite divided. Yes, Apple had technically achieved a remarkable success, but there was also a lot that was criticized about the first iPhone. Its battery life was far too short. The camera could only take photos, not record videos. But even for photos it wasn't particularly well suited as it did not have an integrated flash. The iPhone couldn't handle 3G, didn't support GPS yet, had a modest screen resolution of 320 by 480 pixels, practically had no apps and couldn't sync with a Windows PC. A mobile phone was something you picked up a few times a day when you wanted to make an urgent call on the go or to send a text message. And nobody had a glimpse of the benefits of being continuously online. And by the way, when the iPhone came to the market, there was no App Store, which didn't follow until a year and a half later. Looking back, one might say that all this criticism was perhaps a bit short-sighted and that too many people, including Steve Ballmer as well as, by the way, myself personally, failed to recognize the potential this device could have, but back then this criticism seemed legit. Let's jump to 2023, and Apple has once again introduced a groundbreaking, absolutely revolutionary device a week ago today, at least if you believe Apple. Tim Cook, very much in the tradition of Steve Jobs, spoke of the beginning of a new era. Apple introduced the Vision Pro and the reactions remind me very much of back then. Questions are being asked right now like, who needs something like this anyway? What kind of poor battery life is this? Are we all supposed to walk around with such a thing in the future? Isn't it way too big and too heavy to wear on your head for 8 hours a day? Why is the battery external and hanging on a cable and then only lasts for 2 hours anyway? And the comparison is often made to other VR glasses such as the Quest 3 from Meta, announced for this autumn, which will only cost a fraction of the Vision Pro. So apparently Apple has done everything wrong, even though the Vision Pro might technically impress at one point or another, but for that price, never in a lifetime. Well, and that personally reminds me very much of $500 for a phone, and the situation is indeed very similar, because today, just like back then, Apple is not the first manufacturer to bring such a device to the market. There were smartphones before Apple. Hardly anyone remembers them today because, well, compared to the iPhone, they just weren't good. And there were also VR, AR, MR, XR, whatever you call them, glasses before Apple's Vision Pro. And that today, as back then, at a much cheaper price. Steve Ballmer back then praised the Motorola Q in the mentioned interview, which would cost only $99. And you must ask quite naively, do you remember the Motorola Q? No? Well, me neither. Not even the name rings a bell. And we probably don't need to discuss in detail the lack of smartphone success from Microsoft and the Nokia debacle. All that is history. But the question is, why did it turn out that way? What did Apple or the iPhone do so differently that this phone became such a huge success that it not only made Apple the most valuable company in the world, but also the first company in the world to break the barrier of a company value of $1 trillion. Oh yes, and of $2 trillion. And also of $3 trillion. What's the secret behind Apple's success? The answer often given to this question is that Apple is very innovative. And if you look at Apple's devices, that's true, and at the same time it's not. Much of what Apple does is often not actually new. As just mentioned, Apple didn't build the first smartphone ever with the iPhone. They didn't develop the first MP3 player with the iPod. And they didn't create the first tablet with the iPad. But they were the first to manage, and this is where the real innovation happens, to connect the components that were available on the market and integrate them into a greater whole. The iPhone was the first phone to link a high-quality, multi-touch touchscreen with an operating system, resulting in a really user-friendly overall concept that was fun, that you liked to use, that felt intuitive, ran smoothly, and for which you didn't need to read a manual. What Apple succeeded in doing with the iPhone was to make the smartphone concept suitable for everyday use and easily accessible to end users. The integration of hardware and software and the ability to create simplicity thanks to this integration, that is the actual DNA of Apple. That may sound a bit overblown now, but the point is, the integration of hardware and software is what Apple has always strived for, and they were admittedly very good at it. This is what differentiated Apple from IBM even from the early days on, not expandability and compatibility with everything and everyone at any cost, with all the problems that this entails, but Apple has always solely focused on creating integrated and coherent ecosystems from hardware to software. And this approach, you definitely don't have to like it, and Apple is regularly criticized for the downsides of this path, and rightly so from a certain perspective, but at the end of the day, this is what Apple is really good at. This is their essence, creating integrated experiences from integrated hardware and software. Well, and now there's the Vision Pro. And the first thing you notice is that Apple doesn't mention VR, AR, MR or whatever glasses with a single word. They also don't talk about the metaverse or any other virtual worlds or anything similar. They just call their approach spatial computing. And that's the first important point. The Vision Pro is not a pair of data glasses. It doesn't even want to be that. It just happens to have this form. What the Vision Pro actually is a fully fledged portable computer, just no longer in the classic form factor of a notebook. This is first shown by the hardware used, such as the M2 CPU, which is also in the current Macs and the iPad Pro. But this also becomes apparent with respect to the software that was announced and mentioned. There were surprisingly many business applications like Microsoft Office, all the Adobe graphics tools, communication tools like Teams, Zoom, and so on. And one point that Apple noticeably emphasized is that the Vision Pro can run independently, so it doesn't need a separate computer, but it can integrate into the existing ecosystem if necessary. Quite honestly, to me, this doesn't sound like they are trying to develop the next VR gaming glasses. To me, it sounds like Apple is trying to rethink mobile computing. And if you consider the Vision Pro from this perspective, it actually also puts the price in perspective. $3,499 for a Mac including screens is not an unusually high price. It's even somewhat cheap, in quotation marks, when you compare it, for example, to a MacBook Pro or a Mac Studio. Of course, we don't know yet how much storage the Vision Pro will have, for instance, but I strongly suspect that if Apple is talking about computing and they are installing a desktop-class CPU, then the RAM and SSD will also be in the same range as what we'd find in a Mac. And by the way, that's already the case with the iPad Pro. There, too, we have similar dimensions in terms of performance as with the Mac. Speaking of the Mac, the fact that the Vision Pro is equipped with the M2 means that it can run the same software as the Mac or the iPad Pro, and even if the three respective operating systems might slightly differ and carry different names, that is macOS, iPadOS and visionOS, they are ultimately just variants of a single underlying system. And this brings the option of viewing the Vision Pro as a mobile computer even closer. The question now arises whether a battery life of 2 hours might not be a bit sparse. And the clear answer is, of course, yes. But we must not forget, we are talking about the very first version here. It's not aimed at end users. This first Vision Pro is aimed, and the price makes this very clear, at developers, at people who, pun intended, have a vision of what mobile computing could look like in the future. At least today, it's not about having a productivity equivalent to a MacBook, but about laying the foundation for an ecosystem that can grow into an alternative in a few years. Because, and note the choice of words here, the device isn't called Vision, it's called Vision Pro. That means, as with the MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air, or with the iPad Pro and the iPad Air, or with the Mac Pro and the Mac, Apple leaves room for downward expansion. There will be, sooner or later, an Apple Vision without the Pro, or maybe an Apple Vision Air, that will then target end users in terms of price. Of course, I don't know when that will be, but if we assume a yearly cycle, as usual at Apple, and take the typical approach from Apple that major design improvements and works under the hood will alternate here as well, I could imagine that we'll have a Vision Pro 2 in 2024, which is a bit more refined with a little bit better battery life, and that in 2025 together with the Vision Pro 3, which could then significantly shrink in size and weight, a simple Vision would also appear, perhaps with 4 to 5 hours of battery life for, let's say, $9.99 or $14.99. So in the same pricing area as the MacBook Air today. And with that, Apple then stands ready for the consumer market. Indeed, 2 years is plenty of time to port applications to the Vision Pro and tailor them specifically to this new platform. Not to mention, and this is a critical point, to also bring games to the Vision Pro. Even though Apple has so far largely left this point out of its discussion about the Vision Pro, it is certainly not an irrelevant point. It's interesting that Apple introduced the Apple Game Porting Toolkit a few days ago, which allows developers to predict with manageable effort how much work they would have to put into porting a game to macOS and Co. One could interpret the announcement of this toolkit as the first step towards establishing Apple-based systems as a gaming platform, much more so than previously, and I'm not talking about casual titles as on iOS, but rather about AAA stuff. This, just like the announced cooperation with Disney Plus for entertainment on the Vision Pro, is an important but ultimately not the primary use case. And by the way, 2 years is a lot of time for a software manufacturer to switch to a new platform or to support it additionally in the future. In my opinion, this is also the reason why Apple introduced the Vision Pro at the WWDC, the Worldwide Developers Conference, which primarily revolves around software and is aimed at developers, because that is currently the target group with the Vision Pro. Now, of course, the question remains, why all of this? Even if everything turns out as I just outlined, do we really want to move around on the street with a headset on our head, isolating us from the surroundings? What are the use cases for this? And this seems to be the one question that is currently being asked by many. What is the point of all of this after all? Alright, granted, the Vision Pro is a technically quite impressive device, and let's just take this vision of spatial computing as given for a moment. What for? And with this question, I return to the beginning of this video. Why did the world need an iPhone? If someone outside of Apple had been asked back then, the answer would most likely have been no idea. Because the influence that the internet has on our daily lives today could not have been predicted. We couldn't imagine the immense influence that apps would have on our everyday lives. That it would one day be normal for everyone on the train to look at their phones more or less continuously, and that it would seem rather strange if that weren't the case. And just as that couldn't be predicted, we still can't predict where spatial computing will be in 10 years. However, this does not mean that there are no use cases even today for it. And perhaps these use cases may not be overly extravagant and revolutionary, and maybe there aren't the everyday use cases, so they are not the use cases for the mass market, but they are the beginning of everything. To give a few examples. With the Vision Pro, one could walk through a house while it is still under construction and already take care of the planning of the interior. The same, of course, works on a larger scale, for example, to plan and build and review an airport. In the industrial sector, a machine's user interface could be brought to the user rather than forcing the user to always go to a certain part of the machine, essentially a portable human-machine interface. The same applies to logistics, warehouse management and similar areas where routes could be optimized and visually displayed. And the idea of a medical operation being performed from the other side of the earth inevitably comes to my mind. remotely guiding repair scenarios, virtually reviewing physical construction processes, and so on and so forth. But all these are still very industry-heavy scenarios where in the past one might also have been using the Microsoft HoloLens to some extent, which, by the way, I think is a much more interesting comparison to the Vision Pro than VR glasses like the Meta Quest 3 and Co. And by the way, it's also in a similar price range. However, what all these scenarios have in common is that you usually want to have your hands free, because, for example, you need them for interacting with reality. And it's for this very reason that it's absolutely sensible that the Vision Pro does come without controllers. They would not be a benefit, but an obstacle. And that's precisely why the pass-through in both directions is so essential, because in the real world you rarely travel alone. You need to be able to exchange information, but for that you not only need to be able to perceive the real world also needs to be able to perceive you. And that's why the Vision Pro's external display is so crucial. And yes, currently it looks a little bit creepy with the projected eyes. But 15 years ago it also seemed creepy to imagine that people in public spaces would all be walking around with little black rectangles in their hand, looking at them all the time. Ultimately, that's a matter of getting used to things, and that means it's a matter of time. And I think there are many other little things that prove it could go into this direction. That Apple, with the R1 chip, is developing its own chip to ensure that reality arrives in the internal displays as delay-free as possible to avoid motion sickness, which, by the way, if you believe the first testers, is very well done compared to the competition. That the Vision Pro does not primarily rely on VR, but technically on AR. That there are adapted lenses for people who wear glasses, so they don't have to wear their glasses under the Vision Pro, and so on and so forth. And of course, I haven't worn the Vision Pro myself yet. I also don't have any insider information from Apple. I'm just trying to connect the dots and add one and one together. Whether all of this will really happen remains to be seen. But just to give a thought-provoking impulse as to where this all could lead, maybe in 10 years we will be wearing everyday glasses or maybe even contact lenses that not only show us the price when we look at the product in the supermarket, but also the nutritional information and suitable recipes. And with integrated Apple Pay you can pay. And to prevent such a world from turning into an advertising dystopia, which would be a very obvious thing, the issue of privacy is extremely important. For example, that eye tracking data stays in the device and does not go outside. And this is exactly something that Apple has always placed great value on, privacy, and which they also emphasized with the Vision Pro, that this data actually remains private and does not leave the Vision Pro, and for which companies like Meta are constantly criticized. And if you put all of this together in the end, well, I can't specifically imagine what reality will look like in 2035. I can certainly imagine that the concept shown today with the Vision Pro and the path taken with it will be the beginning of a new era. And that's why I personally am very much looking forward to when the Vision Pro comes to the market in early 2024 and hopefully then also to Europe in the foreseeable future. Because, to conclude with one of my favorite quotes, the best way to predict the future is to create it, which was said by Alan Kay. Well, and with that, I would of course be very interested to know your final thoughts. What do you think of the Vision Pro? How do you rate this product? What do you think of my assessment? Feel free to write that in the comments below. And if you liked the video, feel free to share it with your colleagues. And regardless of that, of course, I wish you a good start to the new week. Take good care of yourself, stay healthy, and see you next time. Bye.